In the scorching summer of 1877, a drifting cowboy named Jacob Morrison rode past a failing homestead in the Nebraska Territory and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the middle of a dried-out wheat field under a sun so merciless it seemed to burn the very air, a young woman was plowing behind a mule that looked half dead from exhaustion, dragging a wooden plow through earth so hard it might as well have been stone. What stopped Jacob cold was not just the sight of a woman doing work that would break most men, but the way she moved. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle, yet she kept going with the mechanical determination of someone who had forgotten there was any other choice. Her dress was more patches than original fabric, her hands were wrapped in bloody rags because she had no gloves, and her face was so gaunt and gray that she looked more like a ghost than a living woman. But what truly terrified Jacob was the brand-new grave marker he could see near the small sod house at the edge of the field, a cross made from barrel staves with a name carved so fresh the wood was still white. The name read Robert Caldwell, and the date said he had died just 5 days earlier. This woman was not just working herself to death in a failed field. She was racing against time to bring in a harvest that would never come, trying to fulfill a promise to a dead man, or perhaps running from something so terrible that collapsing from exhaustion in a wheat field seemed preferable to facing whatever hunted her. When Jacob called out to offer help, the woman spun around with a skinning knife in her hand and a look in her eyes that said she had killed before and would kill again if she had to. In that moment, Jacob understood that the weight she was carrying was far heavier than any plow, and that offering to share her burden might cost him everything he had, including his life. Jacob Morrison had been drifting since the war ended 12 years earlier, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form attachments. He had learned the hard way that caring about people led to loss, that the world was designed to take away everything you loved, and that the safest way to live was to keep moving and keep your heart locked away where nothing could touch it. But something about this woman in the field broke through the walls he had built. Maybe it was the desperation in her movements, or the fresh grave that told a story of recent tragedy, or simply the fact that he recognized in her eyes the same hollow exhaustion he saw in his own reflection. Whatever the reason, Jacob found himself dismounting and walking slowly toward her with his hands raised to show he meant no harm, speaking in the low, calm voice he used with spooked horses. Her name was Sarah Caldwell, and it took 20 minutes of careful talking before she lowered the knife. Even then, she held it ready, watching Jacob with the wariness of a wild animal that had been trapped too many times to trust easily. He told her he was just a drifter looking for work, that he had seen her struggling with the plow and thought she might need help. Sarah's laugh in response was bitter and sharp as broken glass. She told him she had no money to pay hired help, that the bank was going to foreclose on her homestead in 6 weeks if she could not bring in a harvest, that her husband Robert had died trying to dig a well during the hottest week of summer, and his heart had simply given out from the strain. She said all this in a flat, emotionless voice that was somehow more disturbing than tears would have been, as if she had gone past grief into some cold place where feelings could not reach her anymore. Jacob should have ridden away. He had enough problems of his own without taking on the impossible task of saving a failing homestead and a woman who looked like she was already half in the grave herself. But instead, he heard himself offer to help her bring in the harvest in exchange for food and a place to sleep, no wages required. Sarah stared at him with suspicion that bordered on hostility, clearly trying to figure out what he really wanted, what price he would eventually demand for his help. Jacob understood her distrust. In his experience, nobody helped anyone without expecting something in return, and a woman alone on a homestead was vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with failed crops. But he also knew that if he rode away and left her to die slowly in this field, something essential would die inside him too. Some last remnant of the man he had been before the war taught him that human life was cheap, and compassion was a luxury that got you killed. They worked together through that long, brutal day, and Jacob quickly realized that Sarah's situation was even worse than he had imagined. The wheat was stunted and diseased, barely worth harvesting. The mule was old and sick, likely to drop dead before the season ended. The sod house had a roof that leaked and walls that were crumbling. But worst of all was Sarah herself. She was not just exhausted. She was actively dying, pushing her body past every reasonable limit, working 16-hour days on almost no food because she had been saving the supplies for the mule. When Jacob convinced her to stop for the evening and made her sit down while he prepared a meal from his own provisions, he saw that her hands were not just blistered but infected, that she had a fever burning behind her eyes, that she swayed even while sitting still. He asked her why she was killing herself for a harvest that would never be enough to save the homestead anyway, and Sarah's answer came out in a whisper so quiet he almost missed it. She said she had made a promise to Robert, had sworn on his deathbed that she would not let the bank take their land, would not let his dream die with him. But beneath those words, Jacob heard something else. He heard guilt and fear and a desperate need to punish herself for something she would not name. Over the next week, as they worked side by side in the failing fields, Sarah slowly began to talk. She told Jacob that she and Robert had come west 3 years ago from Ohio, running from her family who had tried to force her into a marriage with a wealthy man twice her age. Robert had been a clerk in her father's business, a kind man with soft hands and big dreams who had fallen in love with the boss's daughter. They had eloped and homesteaded in Nebraska, believing that hard work and determination could build them a new life far from the people who wanted to control Sarah's future. For a while, it had worked. They had been poor but happy, struggling but together. Then the drought came, and the crops failed, and Robert started working himself harder and harder to make up for the bad luck, to prove he could provide for his wife, to show he had been worthy of her sacrifice in leaving her family. Sarah had begged him to slow down, to accept that some things were beyond their control, but Robert's pride would not let him rest. He had died digging for water, had collapsed in the hole he was making and never gotten up again, and Sarah blamed herself for not stopping him, for not finding some way to make him understand that she did not need him to be a hero, just needed him to be alive. Jacob listened to all this while his hands worked, cutting wheat and bundling sheaves, and he began to understand why Sarah was driving herself toward the same death that had claimed Robert. She was not trying to save the homestead. She was trying to punish herself for surviving, trying to follow Robert into the grave because living without him felt like a betrayal of everything they had shared. Jacob knew this impulse intimately. He had felt it himself after the war, after watching friends die while he survived. After coming home to find that the life he had left behind no longer existed, he had spent years trying to drink himself to death or provoke someone into shooting him, searching for any way to stop the guilt that came with being alive when better men were dead. It was only exhaustion and cowardice that had kept him breathing, the simple fact that killing yourself took more courage than he possessed. He told Sarah about this one evening as they sat outside the sod house watching the sun set over the failed fields. He told her about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the years he had wasted wishing he had died with them. He told her that he understood why she was working herself to death, but that Robert would not have wanted this for her, that honoring someone's memory did not mean destroying yourself in their name. Sarah listened in silence, and when he finished, she did something unexpected. She told him the rest of the story, the part she had been hiding. She told him that her family had not just disapproved of her elopement. They had hired men to bring her back, had offered a reward for information about her whereabouts. 2 months ago, a stranger had come through the area asking questions about homesteaders from Ohio, describing Sarah with enough accuracy that she and Robert knew her family had found them. Robert had sent the man away claiming ignorance, but they both knew more would come. Robert had been digging the well, partly for water, but partly to create a hiding place, a root cellar where Sarah could conceal herself if her family's men returned. He had died trying to protect her, and now she was alone with the certainty that eventually those men would come back, would take her by force if necessary, would return her to Ohio and the marriage she had fled. This revelation changed everything for Jacob. Sarah was not just fighting to save a homestead. She was trapped between slow death from exhaustion and capture by men who saw her as property to be reclaimed. The failed harvest was almost a mercy in that sense, because once the bank foreclosed, Sarah would have nothing keeping her in Nebraska, would be free to disappear into the vast territory where even determined searchers might never find her. But Sarah refused to consider running. She had promised Robert she would keep their land, and some stubborn core of her believed that abandoning that promise would be the final betrayal, the thing that would prove her family right about her being too weak and foolish to survive without their control. Jacob made a decision that night, one that surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew his history of avoiding commitment and connection. He told Sarah he would stay until the harvest was done, would help her bring in whatever crop they could salvage, and then he would help her disappear so completely that no hired men would ever track her down. He offered this not because he expected gratitude or romance or any kind of future together, but because Sarah reminded him of the person he had been before the war, before loss and guilt had hollowed him out. Helping her felt like saving a part of himself that he thought was lost forever. They worked through the next month like people possessed, bringing in the stunted wheat and storing it in the small barn. Jacob repaired the roof and reinforced the walls, not because he believed they could save the homestead, but because doing good work felt like an act of defiance against a world that seemed designed to destroy hope. Sarah slowly began to eat properly and rest when Jacob insisted, and color started returning to her face. They developed a rhythm, working in comfortable silence during the day and talking by the fire at night, sharing stories about their pasts and carefully avoiding any discussion of the future. Jacob found himself looking forward to those evening conversations, found himself noticing the way Sarah's rare smiles transformed her face, found himself caring about her in ways he had sworn he would never care about anyone again. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after Jacob first arrived. 3 men rode up to the homestead, well-dressed and well-armed, asking for Sarah Caldwell by her maiden name. Jacob met them in the yard while Sarah watched from inside the sod house, her skinning knife in her hand and terror in her eyes. The men said they were working for Sarah's father, that they had authority to bring her home, that they would compensate Jacob for any inconvenience if he simply turned her over to them. Jacob told them Sarah was not going anywhere, that she was a grown woman who had made her choice and had every right to live her own life. The men laughed at him, 3 against 1, clearly not considering a drifting cowboy to be any kind of threat. They were wrong about that. Jacob had learned during the war that desperation made men dangerous, and protecting something he cared about made him more dangerous still. When the leader reached for his gun, Jacob was faster, dropping him with a single shot before the other 2 could react. The second man managed to clear leather before Jacob's second bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The third man wisely raised his hands and did not go for his weapon. Jacob kept his gun trained on him while Sarah came out of the house, no longer frightened, but coldly furious. She walked up to the uninjured man and told him to deliver a message to her father. She said that Robert Caldwell had died defending their dream, that she would die before she went back to Ohio, and that if her father sent more men, they would meet the same fate as these 3. She said it with such absolute conviction that the man believed her, believed that this gaunt woman who had been working herself to death would kill or be killed before she surrendered. After the wounded men rode away carrying their dead companion, Jacob and Sarah stood together in the yard, both shaking with adrenaline and shock. Sarah started laughing and crying at the same time, great heaving sobs of release that seemed to drain all the tension she had been carrying for months. Jacob held her while she cried, and when she finally quieted, she told him something that broke his heart. She said she could not stay at the homestead now, that her father would send an army if necessary, that she had to disappear before more people died because of her. She asked Jacob if his offer to help her vanish still stood, and he told her it did, told her he would take her anywhere she wanted to go, would help her build a new life far from Ohio, and failed homesteads and memories of dead husbands. They left Nebraska 3 days later, after burying Robert's body in a secret location that Sarah's family would never find, after burning the sod house and the barn so there would be nothing left for the bank to claim. They rode west into Colorado territory, where the mountains were high enough to hide in, and the mining camps were full of people who had fled from pasts they did not discuss. Jacob used his savings to buy a small plot of land near a town called Silver Creek, and he and Sarah built a cabin with their own hands, this time using proper lumber and stone instead of sod and hope. They did not speak of marriage or love or any kind of future beyond the next day's work. They simply lived together, two damaged people who had found in each other a reason to keep breathing. Sarah planted a garden and started a small sewing business making clothes for the miners. Jacob hired himself out as a ranch hand and security for the mining operations. Slowly, carefully, they built something that felt like a life. The nightmares came less frequently. The guilt began to fade. The future stopped seeming like something to fear and started seeming like something that might be worth living for. It was Sarah who finally spoke the words one evening 2 years after they arrived in Colorado. She told Jacob that she had loved Robert, would always love him, but that Robert was gone and she was still alive, and Jacob had given her a reason to want to stay that way. She said she did not know if what they had was the same as what she had shared with Robert, but that it was real and valuable and worth naming. Jacob, who had spent years avoiding attachment and emotion, found that the walls he had built had crumbled without him noticing, worn away by quiet evenings and shared work, and the simple presence of someone who understood what it meant to carry weight too heavy for one person alone. They married that spring in a small ceremony attended by miners and ranch hands who had become friends. Sarah wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Jacob had bought with his first profitable season's wages. Jacob wore new boots and a clean shirt and a smile that felt strange on his face because it had been so long since he had last worn one. The preacher asked if they promised to love and honor each other, and they both said yes, and meant it with a fierceness that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival and choice and the decision to build something good from the ruins of everything they had lost. Years later, when people asked how they had met, Sarah and Jacob would tell a simple story about a drifting cowboy who stopped to help a woman in a field. They would leave out the parts about death and pursuit and violence, would skip over the grief and guilt that had brought them together. Because what mattered was not how broken they had been when they found each other, but what they had built from those broken pieces. A home that was solid and warm. A life that was honest and good. A love that had started with one person offering to carry another's load, and had grown into something where the weight was shared equally, where neither person had to bear their burdens alone anymore. Jacob had offered to carry Sarah's load that day in the wheat field, not knowing that she would eventually teach him to put down the weight he had been carrying since the war, the guilt and loneliness and belief that he deserved to suffer. Sarah had accepted his help not because she was weak, but because she was finally strong enough to understand that needing help was not the same as failing, that letting someone stand beside you was not betrayal of the past but affirmation of the future. Together they proved that even people who had given up on happiness could find it again, that even those who thought they deserved only death could choose life, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage was not dying for a lost cause, but living for a new one. The weight Sarah had carried in those fields was crushing her, but the weight they carried together, the shared burden of building a life from nothing, felt light as hope, strong as stone, and real as the mountains that surrounded their home and kept them safe from everything they had left behind.